Half of what's exciting and inspiring about poetry to me happens on the word level. Surprising constructions, daring formulations, tight and vivid utterances, full usage of the language's implications, linguistic dynamism. I think Shakespeare excelled at this. Let me share some examples with you from the beginning of his play, King Lear. In my edition, that's just the first 2 pages and a little bit more. It's until the moment when Lear tells Kent angrily, "O vassal, miscreant," and has his hand on his sword ready to draw it against Kent. This video is not about the story or about the characters, but really a microscopic look at some imaginative and exciting linguistic moments that I think are worthy of admiration and even emulation. These are my top 10 amazing linguistic moments at the beginning of King Lear. My first example, a conversation involving Kent, Gloucester, and Gloucester's son, Edmund, is probably not poetry at all, but prose. There are no lines here signified by a capital letter, which would prove the intention to break the line. And if we scan it, there are so many anapestic replacements for iambs and some real tripping of the beats. And it's so untypical of Shakespeare's habitual iambic pentameter that it must not be poetry. By the way, the prose ends and the poetry begins soon, when Lear, his daughters, and the dukes enter, and Lear speaks for the first time. Anyway, the quote is from Gloucester. Gloucester is talking to Kent about a woman, not his wife, who is Edmund's mother. Gloucester describes Edmund's bastardy by saying his mother had, quote, "a son for her cradle ere she had a husband for her bed," end quote. A simpler version would have been, she had him out of wedlock, but instead, Shakespeare saw an opportunity to describe out of wedlock by showing that one thing came before the other. A son was born before a husband was wed. This is a beautiful parallel construction. Parallel not only because the phrase structure is repeated, but parallel imagistically. Both concretes, cradle and bed, are eloquently illustrative of the nature of a son and a husband, and they're both pieces of furniture on which someone can lie. When Kent is introduced to Edmund, he's impressed by him and tells Edmund he'd like to get to know him better. Edmund feels honored and says so with these words, quote, "I shall study deserving," end quote. Customarily, what would come after the verb study is a subject one can learn or relearn, or something one can delve into in order to understand. One might say, "I shall study astronomy," "I shall study for the test," "I shall study this book." It's interesting to see study used like this, lifted from its normal context. The honor Edmund feels is too deep, because by saying he will study what it means to be deserving, expresses that he senses a gap between what Kent is offering and what Edmund feels his own former deeds and current character can fairly earn. He doesn't want to rely on his current knowledge to go along with the metaphor. He wants to increase it. Edmund is saying that he wants to make himself even more deserving by expressing that he will spend time learning how. He will be like a pupil in terms of the time he will spend learning how to increase his ability to warrant Kent's attention, favor, and friendship. This is thank you that is imbued with both serious humility and serious ambition. Lear sends Gloucester out to attend the lords of France and Burgundy, and then addresses everyone else who entered with him, the dukes and his daughters. He says, quote, "Meantime we shall express our darker purpose." I think this is a remarkable thing to have Lear say. The dark is used often to represent something sinister or gloomy or mysterious. However, I'm fairly certain Shakespeare is not using the word dark to have Lear suggest that his purpose is evil. Why would Lear do that? If that were the case, Lear certainly would have wanted to keep it hidden. What is a dark purpose? It's a purpose you can't see or understand. It's the information he's about to reveal presently, which only he now knows. It's not unheard of to see dark used to represent ignorance, as in the term the Dark Ages. But in the example with Lear, we're not talking about ignorance on a grand scale to describe the condition of a whole time period, or even to describe the condition of a single mind, but ignorance of one piece of information, a virtual synonym for not known, or in this case, not known to others. It's like if someone asked, "Where did he go?" and one responded with, "That's dark to me," instead of, "I don't know." I think it's interesting that this word is used in complete exclusion of what it might typically suggest metaphorically, something sinister or gloomy. It's also interesting because it's used as a living, breathing adjective describing the lack of very specific information. I say living, breathing because although there are uses of dark as a metaphor for a lack of knowledge, as in the Dark Ages, as I mentioned, such a phrase is really a metaphoric fossil or a frozen metaphor. Dark is typically not used as a free synonym for lack of knowledge. Another thing about this phrase, Lear says our darker purpose and not dark. Why darker? I assume it means that he had been talking with his guests before they entered the room about topics that everyone already knew about, so the topic he wants to discuss now will be new for the others. Further along in the same speech, Lear says, quote, "'Tis our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths." End quote. Lear wants to give the responsibilities he has as king to others because it's too much for him, he feels, at his age. Shakespeare uses the verb shake, a very tangible, imaginable action, to represent part of that abstract situation. We can see how it works because if he distributes kingly tasks to the dukes, in a sense, something is coming off or coming away from him. Perhaps the image of a dog shaking itself to free its coat from water comes to mind, or someone shaking a blanket out to remove the dust from it. Those pictures suggest something becoming cleaner or lighter, and this seems to be Lear's intention. His responsibilities are too heavy for him. Shakespeare's use of concrete actions to represent something abstract is a technique that he often employs. But interestingly, he doesn't stay long with this metaphor, or even with this level of concretization. He says he will shake all business from himself and will confer them on others, meaning give or grant. And so we're back on the abstract level. Confer is a word that describes exactly what he'll do without a figure of speech. So you can see how Shakespeare has visited the concrete and figurative level just for a moment and then returns to straightforward expression. This free exchange between the concrete and the abstract, the figurative and the actual, is, I think, part of what gives Shakespeare his tremendous linguistic dynamism. He draws freely and flexibly from both levels. The figurative occurs so frequently in his poetry that it becomes casual and understated, which means, to enjoy this dynamic interplay between the two levels, we are encouraged to pay very close attention. When Lear asks his eldest daughter, Goneril, to tell him how much she loves him, she says, quote, "I love you more than word can wield the matter." End quote. Wield means to control or operate something with the body, like with the hands and arms, so to carry or hold something, especially with a skillful handling, so like the skillful use of a tool or weapon. Clearly, wield is another example of Shakespeare using a concrete to represent an abstract, because words can't wield anything, of course, like a person can wield a tool. What Goneril is basically saying is, the subject is too difficult or large for her to express satisfactorily with her own words. But with wield, we have a very apt visual of unskillful handling, something awkward to hold, too big for one's hands, or something even too heavy to pick up. So that's interesting, but what's also interesting here is how Shakespeare writes word in the singular. Shakespeare might have written, "I love you more than words can wield the matter." After all, when discussing anything, don't you need more than just one single word? But he definitely chose the singular. I believe it's because if he wants to evoke the visual of someone trying to pick up and clumsily hold some object, he needs a singular word here, not a plural word. A word in the plural would have put the image out of focus, because we would think of many individuals trying to lift some one thing, and that's not as clear or immediate as the image of one individual trying to do that. This use of the word for an entire utterance or that which is said is a well-established use and is entry 2 in the Oxford English Dictionary, with examples going back over 1,000 years in the quotations. It's in the phrase, "Can I have a word with you?" for example. So Shakespeare's use of it is standard, I would say, but I think it's noteworthy that he had the choice to use a word either in the plural or the singular, and he chose the one that made the most sense in terms of the visual it evokes. Here is an example that creates expectation and surprise using a list. In this passage, Lear is showing on a map what portion of his kingdom is to be given to Goneril. He says, quote, "Of all these bounds, even from this line to this, with shadowy forests and with champaigns riched, with plenteous rivers and wide-skirted meads, we make thee lady." End quote. The list has 4 members: shadowy forests, champaigns riched, plenteous rivers, and wide-skirted meads. They occur over the course of 2 lines. In the first line, shadowy forests is an adjective followed by a noun. Champaigns riched is the reverse, a noun followed by an adjective. What happens on the second line? Plenteous rivers. Okay, that starts the line in the same way the first line started, adjective noun, and these 2 phrases, shadowy forests and plenteous rivers, are metrically equivalent. Shadowy forests, plenteous rivers. With the first 3 members of the list, it might be possible to say a pattern has been created and we might be able to expect something. We could reasonably expect that the next thing on the list is a phrase containing a noun followed by an adjective that's metrically equivalent with champagnes riched. It's happened once before. Will it happen again? But the 4th and last member of the list subverts our expectation and does so in several ways. It's wide-skirted meads. Firstly, the order of the words is not what we expected, not in noun-adjective sequence as it was with champagnes riched. Also, the meter is different from its counterpart champagnes riched, which had 3 syllables and 2 beats, whereas wide-skirted meads has 4 syllables and 2 beats. Also, this is the first adjective of its kind, being a compound one, an adjective built from 2 words. Another thing to note is the first 3 things in our list each contained the word with shadowy forests and with champagnes riched, with plenteous rivers, but the last thing, and wide-skirted meads, no with, which has been elided, or it's understood to be there, but left out. I think it would have been interesting to either fulfill or subvert the expectation. Both would have been delightful, but the real fascinating thing is that an expectation was set up at all, and it was done by the use of linguistic structures. To express how displeased Lear is with Cordelia, Shakespeare might have had him say some version of, "I don't want anything to do with you, and I withdraw any help or even pity you might have got from me." But Shakespeare increases the intensity, having Lear compare his daughter to a cannibal. He says, quote, "The barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighboured, pitied, and relieved, as thou, my sometime daughter." End quote. I have a feeling Lear is not going to entertain barbarians in his palaces, so Cordelia is just as welcome, in other words, not welcome at all. Let's look at the part, "he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite." I think we can paraphrase it as, "he who makes his children into meals to gorge himself on." What's going on grammatically with "makes his generation messes" is simply to make something something. That use of make is entry number 49 for make in the Oxford English Dictionary, to cause a person or thing to be or become. There are lots of quotations in that entry from the year 1000 to 1890. Here's one paraphrased example. the defeat made him a wanderer. This idea of change in this use of make might be clearer if it had been written, "He that makes his generation into messes," because into supports the idea of transition or change. By the way, the use of make with into is entry number 50 in the Oxford English Dictionary, a separate entry. Shakespeare's version, though, is tight and concise. He takes advantage of the possibility of leaving out a word. That's an unusual phrase, makes his generation messes. He uses an abstract term, generation, for something one might have referred to more concretely, children, and this barbarian turns his generation into meals, or as Shakespeare writes, messes. The Oxford English Dictionary has mess as a prepared dish of a specific kind of food. So the rare word, the figure of speech that substitutes a higher abstraction for a concreter one, and the density achieved by choosing to not include a preposition, make for a strange-sounding phrase, but when you figure out how it works, it's delightful for its novelty. When Lear becomes furious with his youngest daughter, Cordelia, threatening that she will inherit nothing, Kent tries to reason with him, saying, quote, "Royal Lear, whom I have ever honored as my king, loved as my father, as my master followed, as my great patron thought on in my prayers," end quote. It stops there because he's interrupted by Lear. This is a list with past participles as its members: honored, loved, followed, thought on. Let's look at the first, honored as my king. If we mark the parts of this phrase, we'll be able to see the development easier. First, past participle, honored, then the phrase, as my, then a noun, king. The next member of the list has the exact same structure, loved, as my, father, A, B, C. Notice it does not have the same metrical pattern because king ends as a strong beat and father ends on a weak beat. And that might be the reason for the change, which we'll now see. But anyway, the third member of the list has as my first. So it's no longer A, B, C, but B, C, A, as my master followed. That puts us in an interesting position because we've had A, B, C twice, and then a new structure, B, C, A. Will Shakespeare repeat the new structure or go back to the original one? Well, he decides to keep the new pattern, B, C, A, but look what he does. As my is first, as expected. Next, we should have a noun, that's the C position, and we do, but every time before there had been a pure noun. Here we have a noun with an adjective, great patron. It's the same yet different, a development. And now the last position, it's not merely a participle like honored, loved, or followed, but a whole phrase, thought on in my prayers. As a consequence of these changes, we also observe a metrical development across the list. Honored as my king has 3 beats, loved as my father has 2, as my master followed has 3, and as my great patron thought on in my prayers has 5 beats, an entire line of pentameter. That is a fascinating example of how one can create development across a list, keeping it fresh and interesting, while it remains, at its core, a simple list. Lear becomes angry with Kent for trying to interfere, and he threatens to have Kent executed. Kent responds with, quote, "Answer my life, my judgment," end quote. To paraphrase that, if I'm to be executed for this judgment I'm pronouncing, then let it be so, or may my life suffer the consequences of my judgment. Answer here is in the subjunctive mood, which expresses that something is not a fact. It can be used to express a wish or a command. You've probably heard the phrases, "God save the Queen," "Far be it from me to criticize you, but," or "Be that as it may." Those are all examples of the present subjunctive, but those are frozen phrases. Here, Shakespeare uses it as a living, breathing, flexible construction. He takes advantage of it to the full here, creating an utterance so stripped down to its barest elements It sounds strange and dissonant. It's hard to find the head or the tail of the sentence. We might admire the my life and my judgment parallel construction, but which noun is the subject of the sentence? I think it's life. May my life answer for my judgment. Although at first glance this phrase might look unintelligible, it's just very compact, efficient English. Where but in poetry would you find such fascinating constructions? Lear says angrily to Kent, quote, "Out of my sight," end quote. Kent picks up on the word sight, using it for the literal sense of seeing, but also with the idea of understanding or knowing. "See better, Lear," he responds. Lear doesn't want Kent in the room anymore, doesn't want to have to see him, but also Lear won't see or acknowledge Kent's argument. It must be that see now has become more than literal vision, and now means acknowledgement or understanding, because why would Kent say that Lear's actual eyesight is poor? Kent's next sentence is, "And let me remain the true blank of thine eye." I believe blank is relating to section 2a and the entry for blank as a noun in the Oxford English Dictionary, which says a blank is the white spot in the center of a target, hence, figuratively, anything aimed at. So Kent wants Lear to aim his focus at the best place, the bull's eye, both, I think, at Kent himself, perhaps Lear is looking away just now, and at Kent's sensible words. And I think Kent says, "Let me remain," because Kent has apparently always been one of Lear's trusted advisors. It was intelligent of Shakespeare to have used Lear's word sight as a pivot, turning a simple phrase that really means get out of the room into a comment on how Lear is making himself blind to the truth, because if he orders Kent out, he is ordering the truth out. Don't you love Shakespeare? Lear becomes so exasperated by Kent, he tells him, quote, "The bow is bent and drawn, make from the shaft." Isn't that the most beautiful threat you've ever heard? Lear is so furious at Kent, all he has to do, don't you just see it, is move his fingers just slightly and the arrow will kill Kent. Kent is that close to being executed. So he'd better make from the shaft, to paraphrase, get out of the way of the arrow, meaning stop talking and leave. So I've come to the end of my top 10 amazing linguistic moments at the beginning of King Lear. These struck me the most and were ones about which I thought I would have the most to say. But even in this excerpt, there's still so much to unpack and explore and enjoy, and there's still the entire play left. If you liked this, please consider supporting me on Patreon or purchasing a book of my own poetry, which I released a few months ago. If you like Shakespeare, you might like this, because I try in my own poetry to find what to me are beautiful, unique, and interesting linguistic moments. There's a physical version and a PDF version available. All the links will be below. Thanks for watching. Now go take a look at the rest of Lear and enjoy the wonderful English.